Welcome back. I'd like to get us to think a few minutes about the idea of covenant faithfulness and failure that we've been reading about in Joshua and Judges and Ruth and on into Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles. It seems to me that it's important to reflect back on this issue of worldview in the First Testament. Remember, toward the beginning of our study of the First Testament, we talked about the function of the prologue of the Torah, the first 11 chapters of Genesis, to set the stage for the gospel, apart from which, really, none of the rest of the scripture made sense. Chris Wright, in his Old Testament Ethics for the People of God, concludes that people everywhere, people in every culture, ponder questions like, where are we? I mean, what sort of world do we live in? How do we get here? What's in store for this universe? Who are we? What's it mean to be human? And are we really different from the animals? If so, how? What's gone wrong? I mean, how things get the way they are. And then fourth, what's the solution? I mean, can anything be done to make things right? Is there hope? In what? Or in whom? Or is it just cross your fingers? Well, we've been reflecting on the way the Torah, and now as we move into the former prophets, handle these questions. The world we know is part of a good creation by a one-of-a-kind good God. He's not part of the universe. He's above and beyond it, and yet He's in it. He's sovereign over every bit of it. And we are image bearers of this one true God, created to live in an intimate relationship with Him and in relationship with other humans. What went wrong was a spiritual coup d'etat. Our forebears chose autonomy over intimacy with God, and this moral failure has infected every facet of our lives and our world. The solution can only come from this same good God who's taken the initiative to love us anyway and to launch this grand reconciliation project, beginning with calling Abram and Sarah to start a new family, a faith community, through whom God would bring the blessing of salvation to all peoples. Remember Moses' claim back in Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 37, 38? It's because He loved your fathers. Therefore He chose their descendants after them, and He personally brought you from Egypt by His great power, driving out from before you nations greater and mightier than you, to bring you in and to give you their land for an inheritance, as it is to this day. Know therefore today, and take it to heart, that the Lord, He is God in heaven above and on earth below. There is no other. And then again in Deuteronomy chapter 7, verse 6, for you are a holy people to the Lord your God. The Lord your God has chosen you to be a people for His own possession out of all the peoples who are on the face of the earth. The Lord didn't set His love on you or choose you because you were more in number than any of the peoples, for you were fewest of all peoples, but because the Lord loved you and kept the oath that He swore with your fathers. The Lord has brought you out by a mighty hand and redeemed you from the house of slavery, from the hand of Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. Know therefore that Yahweh, your God, He is God, the faithful God, who keeps His covenant and His chesed, His steadfast love, to 1,000 generations with those who love Him and keep His commandments. Remember this later when we consider the prophets preaching Torah. So, for example, Jeremiah preaches that Yahweh declared to Israel in the wilderness, I have loved you with an everlasting love. Therefore, I've continued my faithfulness to you in Jeremiah 31. And this certainly fits the Exodus narrative in Exodus 15, where Moses says to Yahweh, in your steadfast love, you have led the people who you have redeemed. In your strength, you've guided them to your holy habitation. See, God deemed to create this community to be a set apart, different, holy nation, a priestly kingdom that would represent God to the world and represent the world to God. And so, the nature of God's grace of calling to Abraham and Sarah was missional, that the blessing of salvation might come to persons of every nation. And the nature of the promise God makes to Abe by grace is covenantal. God calls it an everlasting covenant. Remember back to Genesis 17. So, to the next generation after the Exodus, Moses reminds God's people how God loved his covenant people. Deuteronomy 33. And that's why he gave them Torah to guide them. And then Moses affirms, the eternal God is your refuge, and underneath are the everlasting arms. So, as we continue our venture in the First Testament, I think we're going to see that David gets it. And in his farewell speech in 2 Samuel 23, he minds folks that God has made with me an everlasting covenant, ordered in all things and secure. Well, we've seen that this calling was, in the first instance, to a person rather than a place. Abe, remember, was called to follow God. The place wasn't even identified at that point. And the Abraham-Sarah narratives show that their focus was not on the perks. Remember his response to Lot's request about the land? And then Abe's response to that heart-rending instruction, take now your son, your only son, Isaac, the son whom you love, and offer him there as a burnt offering. And without skipping a beat, the next line is, so Abram arose early the next morning. You see, he's convinced that with respect to the sacrifice, Yahweh will see to it for himself. Chapter 22, verse 8. And the account states that this was proof that Abe had this faithful fear of Yahweh. Well, there's one other element of the covenant, and that's the land. Remember back to the covenant that God made with Abe. Yahweh said, I'll give to you and to your offspring after you the land of your sojournings, all the land of Canaan, for an everlasting possession, and I will be their God. Then again in chapter 48, Jake reminds Joe that Yahweh had promised, I will make you fruitful and multiply you and make you a company of peoples, and will give this land to your offspring after you for an everlasting possession. So, from this, Chris Wright deduces three pillars of Israel's worldview that supported their theology, their ethics. God himself, society, this family he was developing, and the land. Think about that for a moment. We'll talk more about it when we get back together.